Thank you, Bukonola. Good evening to everybody, and thank you all for joining us. I feel like I joined this call and walked into a friend group that I'm new to. So I think the first question, I suppose, could be about um, to a question to both of you. What does friendship make possible in the work of institutional building? And I think that given that this exhibition is born out of a friendship, how do personal relationships marked by trust, mutual learning, or even disagreement shape the ethos of and sustainability of artist-run spaces such as SCCA and Nairobi Contemporary Art Institute? Yes, what is the quality of your friendship? Are you okay? We can start with
Uh,
you, Ibrahim. Oh, Michael, yes, sir.
go for it, Ibrahim. How you doing, buddy?
Oh, we're very well, Michael. It's very good to see you. It's been a while. I think sometimes because of the nature of the arts world and working on different projects, sometimes it could take a long time before you even see a colleague or friend of yours. It could take sometimes years. Yeah, but
It's
I'm glad
true.
that Michael and I have been having these conversations for a long time. The good thing is that we both work with the same gallery in London, White Q. So occasionally, whether we like it or not, we do bump into each other. So, no, but it's good that we've been talking a lot about the work that Michael has been doing in Kenya and what it means to the ecosystem. Of course, myself, like coming from Ghana, I spent most of my time at the university in Kumasi studying, and it was the initial friendships that I had there with professors and colleagues alike. One of our colleagues, Salom Kuji Abraham, who curated the show he's the artistic director at SCCA. He curated the show in Nkai. He and I were actually classmates in uni. We were in the same hall of residence.
Okay.
So I've known him ever since I was 18. And we even at the time when we're in uni, we used to talk about this idea of building institutions and like the idea of opening up arts because we came from a background where it wasn't so much about making art as art for art's sake, but it was more or less about this conceptual approach of thinking of art as a gift and like going into like the nuances of it and trying to build it in such a way that it really influences the ecosystem and all that. So these friendships that we had over time with him together with other people, once I started thinking about this idea of physically manifesting this, then I went back to these same people and I said, look, this is what I'm thinking about. At least now there is resource and capital to build something. How do we put together, how do we put together our friendship in order to be able to make this thing work? So most of the people that I work with or I've worked with are all people that I've known on a friendship level for so many years. And I don't think the institution would have been sustainable or would be possible without that. It's a gift in itself. The idea that the people who you're working with, they really do understand what you want to do or what all of us have a collective idea, but at least the resource or it has to come from somewhere. So someone might contribute a resource, someone might contribute labor, someone might contribute this here and there. So I think when Michael first wrote to me about this idea of doing this collaboration and then hosting each other, I thought it was actually quite brilliant because it takes quite a lot of trust to be able to at least start these kinds of conversations.
When did you first start thinking about SCCA
I was
in its
born
shape?
it
Yeah,
I to be honest with you, I started making drawings on SCCA when I was already in uni. So this is in 2009.
incredible, incredible.
And I only had the money to build it in 2014 when my first artwork was sold to the Saatchi Gallery. So it took 5 years to get the physical resource. Then I was like, okay, now I have to do this. Yeah. But
That's incredible, man. Um, Amazing. But I think what you said is so true. Like, and Kai wouldn't have got off the ground without Ayako, who is like with you guys, you and Salam. Ayako is one of my oldest friends, and 2017, 18 is when I started thinking about it, and like it was clear to me, one, because I wasn't based in Nairobi, and secondly, I don't have the sort of practice that fits very easily with institution building. They're very separate in a sense. The thinking isn't separate, but the practicality, the physical doing is different. It was clear to me that I would need someone else to do it, and there's just a certain level of fundamentally trust, as you said, that you need to, when you're putting all your resources into something like that you need, and also just simply to enjoy the process. It's super helpful having people that are the team has evolved and changed a lot on our side now, where it's very much from beyond, has moved beyond that, not beyond enjoying working with you all, but just simply beyond my friendship group initially, which is exciting. And fundamentally, I don't think NCAI would exist without Ayako. There to do the heavy lifting. And then when it comes to this particular show, I mean, I've just been watching in utter admiration everything that Ibrahim's been doing on the other side of the continent. I just can't iterate like what it must take. I actually don't know what it must take, for you to have and your crew to have really brought that place together. I mean, the ambition of thought is pretty much unparalleled. I don't know another space like you're doing, with the intention that you have, that is of a similar scale, and also that you just keep dreaming bigger. I think you're completely bloody mad. But
That's the whole point.
yeah, man, absolutely. It definitely takes a madman to bring something like that into being. But I'm sorry, I have so many questions, but I don't want to take over what you're saying.
I think the question about friendship was very much one about proposing new cultural modes, alternative cultural modes, and I think that's very much what both spaces have done in many respects. And I think this exhibition happening between Nairobi and Tamale, which both in their own respects are hosting cities, they're arrival cities, right? Though Nairobi is significantly more central to the myth of nation than Tamale is, both of them are cities that receive different populations, rural to urban, or migrant populations, or in colonial times, populations all along the bureaucratic hierarchy. So I guess a follow-up question would be, to what degree the project Notes on Friendship is about deploying this type of space in a politicized context to invert the relationship between the host and the guest. And I think we all come from relatively different hosting cultures. Like East Africans are very proud about how we receive people, and we very much privilege the position of being a host. And I think it ties in as well to infrastructure, that the living room is the center of the household, and it provides different opportunities for people to activate politically, but also especially socially at a day-to-day level. So how can institution building be a strategy towards providing space to people who don't necessarily feel at home? And I think this project shows many different examples of that. The exhibition shows many different examples of that. But what are the priorities and urgencies for you in that respect? For you both. We can start with Ibrahim again.
No, I think for me, one of the things that I find really important and incredible that Michael's work is his interest in the older generation. So, for instance, Michael has quite a really important collection of artists across different generations, but the emphasis on the much older generation. When we in 2000 and 17. I was doing a residency in Germany at the time, and I had this idea suddenly of what would it mean if the studio which I was building, which became the Savannah Center, could be used actually to host exhibitions of older artists. At the time, I wasn't really thinking of it. When I started building it, it wasn't originally meant to be like this public institution. But then, because I was spending a lot of time in Europe traveling, seeing different exhibitions, all these retrospectives and all that, I asked myself, like, there's so many artists on the continent who've done really important work. But again, also, it's also based on our generation because you're also thinking about your own work and you're thinking,
Mm,
what happens to my work in the next 50 years?
mm,
So, this idea that we can somehow invest in another generation because we can also not deny the fact that even economically, the way that our works play on the market is not the same way that maybe artists 50 years ago, they didn't have access to that same kind of market systems and all that. So the question is that how do we reinvest the residues of some of our labor in terms of like opening up these spaces which can host these like the work of these artists. So Kofi Dawson, who was the first artist that we were able to show, one of our colleagues, Bernard Akwe Jackson, was very gracious that he curated the exhibition, and we had all the students from the university coming in to help, and a lot of them were even there were students but they were also like of that same mindset of this idea that of course when we're at the university making exhibitions with the Black Star Lines and all that, the collective, the idea was that students would contribute their labor the same way as professors and other people alike, all other comrades alike. So it was actually quite interesting that some of the students even would volunteer, though I would pay them to go to the artist studio to help them to be able to like resurrect some of their old works, to restore even their studio in itself and all that. So the idea of building an institution as a hosting firm, I think for me, it's the physicality of the institution is important, but it's more or less about the spirit and the idea.
mm.
Because the idea is that we have to somehow motivate an entire generation to think that they almost have to act like archaeologists in a way. Because whilst once it's being an artist, it's not just so much about being able to make beautiful paintings or sculptures or objects or installations, as Michael and I do, but it's more or less about how we're able to stretch the ideas within that in such a way that it can actually physically affect the material forms around us. And in that, it's a very political because I always say that the artist studio is a political space which allows for the reconstitution of ideological forms and many other material forms. So by building an institution, a studio or an institution or whatever, it allows for us to be a bit more sensitive to the conditions around us in such a way that we all do agree that we share these similar conditions within the ecosystem of the world that we live in, and then we all contribute, whether we are audience, whether they're audience, they're older artists, they're younger artists, we all do understand that this is an idea that we have to strive towards. This idea of like constantly being in the state of repair and then regeneration.
That's super interesting. So in order to be a host, you have to have people to host. So someone's got to want to come. And
Exactly.
has your approach to providing whatever it is that makes people come changed since starting?
No, it hasn't. It's actually even
Mm,
gets it even gets better, though it gets more challenging sometimes. But you realize that when there is a void and nothing exists, sometimes you tend to think that it is what it is, and that is just what it is until something seems to occupy that void, and you realize that people were always waiting for something to happen, and suddenly now that it is there, they actually want to even be more active participants within it. But I also
mm,
think that already, because my thinking was that historically, like people, I remember when I wanted to build like SCCA in the North, a lot of people who are back, aside my professors and like colleagues, people would say, oh, but why would you want to build this thing in the middle of nowhere in the North? Who is going to come? The people there don't know what art is. It's not a center of the art world. But then I remember in Europe, some people told me that, but do you think this is going to work? And I said, I don't know. That's not the point. The point is not whether it works or not. The point is that can this thing instigate like some kind of an interest in the people in the community? Already people are like I remember my grandmother's generation. They were collecting cloth, plates, and all kinds of other things. Even people who claim they're sophisticated who live in the cities, a lot of people don't collect things. They're thinking about buying the next car or buying the next house. So the question of culture has always been there, regardless of the conditions that people find themselves in. And this idea of building an institution somehow is a reminder that collectively, if we look through, let's say, our traditional histories and all that, because we are constantly in this question of restitution and all these things, it brings us back to a certain point. And building these things reminds us about what people actually, what people need within this world that we live in.
Super interesting. Sorry, I'm gonna answer something as well. It's just
Please do, Michael.
What's what do you feel that you're doing that that invites people in? Is it for example, is it the program? I mean, I think also quite uniquely, you've been thinking about inspiring ambition as well in kids, which is kind of different. That's not only encouraging a more literal reading of the imagination, but it's really also trying to light some bigger type of ambition in kids. What are the sort of things? Because again, just in case people here also haven't fully understood what the insanity of your project.
Oh no, not at all.
And the
I think
breadth
it's
of it.
similar to yours because workshops, of course, when you have an institution, the idea is that you want to activate it in many forms, inviting artists over to do workshops, inviting people from the agricultural field, because there's a question of land also to work on things regarding like land ecosystems. We're working with like physicists. We have this program which every year we have like the physics departments. We bring some number of professors and students, and then we rent buses, and these buses goes to communities and brings like kids from the communities. We do workshops, we feed them. We currently we have two artists from South Africa, from Bloemfontein, who are doing a residency here, so they'll run some workshops. So that kind of a thing, the idea, and also like hosting exhibitions, of course, like this exhibition in Nairobi, which would later on also be done here, but of course many other exhibitions, retrospectives, all kinds of other things. The basic idea is just to be able to create interesting visual forms or whatever, which can actually bring people to the institution. And when they come to the institution, then all kinds of things happen.
Yeah,
I think that's interesting, Ibrahim, that you speak about the collecting practices of your grandmother, because in many respects, art restaurant spaces, and especially here on the continent, are often framed as a response to some kind of infrastructural absence. And I wonder, again, to both of you, what kind of frameworks are you rejecting, and what new ones are you proposing? And not knowing that much about Tamale, I wonder what frameworks already exist, or what you perceive to be the frameworks that have supported the kind of institutions that you were able to build. Ibrahim, you talked about the conversations that you had early in your practice with your instructors, and with, and again, we all spoke about like the importance of friendship in buffering, or like bolstering institution making. So yeah, I wonder what forms already exist, and what forms you feel challenged to respond to, and if at all there are challenges in the environment, how are those articulated? And I have to suppose that some of those challenges are why it has come to be important to both of you to act as hosts in some respect, because not everybody can be a host, I think, right?
Yeah, you're right. I don't think it's everyone that is meant to do this kind of work because it requires quite a lot of sacrifice, I must say, especially when you are actually thinking about because for me, I've always thought about this idea of the gift. It already comes to us through the inspiration that we have based on like the traumas of history, memory itself that inspires us as artists to be able to create. And I think that in itself, as some kind of a ghost or operation, which somehow also goes a long way to influence us either through literature or whatever, it inspires us to be able to produce work. But then that also translates our work also through the art market, translates into a new form of residue, which comes back to the question of capital again. So for me, the question has always been, how do we use that capital to re-influence or to reconstitute the order of things? So if you find yourself, for instance, in East Africa or in like West Africa, where if you go to Nigeria and some of the countries around, sometimes you come to realize that they actually invest a bit more into like building cultural institutions. Though they might not be running very well, but at least there is something. But there's always been this big void in Ghana. Of course, there were a lot of interest in, like, there were galleries here and there that really supported artists and did things. But this idea of like having like contemporary art institutions or even building institutions that was like really dedicated to the language of arts made in the 20th century, there was kind of a big void in it. And as artists, I think that somehow it is our role to be able to fill that. In Tamale, before I came here to build this thing, it was like zero. There are no public parks. There are no cinema spaces. Like we have like the Tamale Library, but like it's like half functioning. So it's always this question of the lack of resource. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we've had on the continent. It's not just even just in relation to arts, in the field of medicine, agriculture, all these other fields, all these engineering, there are problems in all these other sectors. But I somehow felt that investing into building arts institutions was important, because I always tell people that art is like medicine is important. If you go to the hospital and you don't get the ventilator, you'll die. In art, it's not as if we don't make an artwork, people will die. No one will die. But then it's a question of like living. How are people able to like really reflect on their life? Like culture somehow brings that essence of living and allows us to be able to like reflect. So for me, the idea of the infrastructure is one of the most important things. And so Inkai is a perfect example also of that, of dedicating time and space in order to be able to make things happen. Once you have the infrastructure and you also have the not just the physical, but also the human infrastructure, the intellectual capability and everything, all these things come together. And in all, you also actually believe that there is an audience around you that actually fits into what you're thinking about. Because sometimes people think, oh, I want to do this, but I don't think that the human intellect or infrastructure in this space does not meet it halfway. But you cannot know, you know. The question of the human intellect is very sophisticated and also very open. So you have to believe, and then you have to take a leap of faith, and then you build something, and then the audience is around you, even if everything is at a point of ground zero. I think even that's where it's interesting, because we all have come to understanding that there is something that we are striving for, and then collectively we come together in order to be able to fulfill that or make that happen.
Yeah, I think also that question that you had about like what what do you choose, like what models do you follow and what do you leave and go with. I think certainly to me, I've found that, or I've felt and wanted NCAI to exist as an experiment. I think what is clear that there have been many things that have come and gone for one reason or another. And if the reason for that is just resources, then the challenge is to make sure that doesn't happen again. If the reason for that is that the model doesn't speak to people beyond the art world, the challenge is to rethink that again. If the reason is that there's nothing that positions art where one, if you haven't grown up around it, which is the majority of people, there is a relevance and ability to relate, then the challenge is that. And I didn't feel, and I still don't feel, that I have enough knowledge about not how people talk about the failure of institutions, but the actual reasons that something comes to be and falls. In terms of Western museums, I personally have always found it difficult that they claim to speak for everyone. Like, I always thought, if you're going to do that, you're setting yourself up to fail from the very beginning. And I knew that that was something I didn't want us to, at NCAI, to try and claim. But that we are open enough to adjust and hopefully slowly, I would say, find a form that best serves our communities. whichever ones those are. I think it's kind of more how I personally have looked at NCAI. Again, I haven't been someone. I think this again is a bit of a difference where Ibrahim has been thinking about the kind of institutions in a very deep way for a very long time, and I came to NCAI really in 2017, asking a few artists in Nairobi what we needed. And that's really why my philosophy is also as it is, because also those needs change over time. And to me, I don't see the point in us as NCAI continuing trying to fulfill a gap if there isn't a gap. I would very happily, if someone suddenly had this extraordinary historical art collection that appeared and was public in Nairobi, I don't see why we should be doing that then. If someone suddenly had a fantastic alternative in terms of a type of higher education, I don't see why we would then be putting our resources to that. So in a way, and I hope NCAI is able to adjust itself and continue to do that. But from the resources point of view, I do think it's an incredibly difficult challenge. And I think that's also partly for me what is exciting about this and doing this kind of institutional residency, is it's sharing resources on every level. We get the pleasure of you guys coming and showing us how you do things, and otherwise we're a very young team. We don't have multiple experience in people who've done stuff in all sorts of places. And this is an extraordinary way for us to have the experience of not only working with you guys, but seeing another way of thinking. And the beauty is, and I have to admit, this is one of the things that personally I've found very difficult about losing Koyo, is just having someone to bounce ideas off who has a different take on what institutions should be. Like for me, she really was somebody that I disagreed with a lot, and I loved it for that. That's and in the same way, I think it's beautiful, and I've always appreciated with you, Ibrahim, is that there are our two ways of approaching are really quite different. Fundamentally, we're doing the same thing, but or similar enough. Hence that we're able to do this switch. But there have been different approaches, and I think that's something that is very special and very important for everyone to know and realize, is that there are so many different ways of skinning the cat. Yes.
Thank you both. I suppose the next question could be one about how easy it has been or how difficult it has been. Just the question of mobility, continental mobility, and how portable these forms are. I have to suppose that you worked through and talked through many different ideas before you came to a form that could travel easily to Nairobi and then back to Tamale or vice versa. Yeah, and I wonder how you experience this ideal of Pan-Africanism where flights cost $2,000 and none of us can get a visa, but the project is good. It's a really great concept. So yeah, how close do you feel that Tamale and Nairobi have been through this process, and what are the aspects that have made them sort of
it's super difficult? There's no ease or ease and closeness or whatever, in all honesty. I think the show was delayed by 2 weeks, I think, and it was delayed a week before the opening, basically, because of shipping problems. The shipping was exponentially more expensive than we thought. The budget for the show was subsequently more than we thought, but the will is there, so you make it work. But there is no easy path. But yeah, I don't know what your thinking is. And then I take my hat off to both teams for making it work and adjusting, because there were adjustments as well in the selection. But yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I think Salom did quite a really good job together with your team Yeah, because also when I was discussing with this with Salom, because anytime we're working, we're like, we really have to also think about the economic commitments and all that because if because Michael is having to pump like through Inkai all this money to be able to make this work, to be able to host this. And from our side, in terms of like selecting artists and then being able to like get artists whose works are strong, they're both formally and also like from idea, like the ideas and also the material point of view, but also economically, it should be like sustainable and all that. So balancing those are always not the most easy things, but of course, eventually you have to be able to ship some things. And also that's what the reality dawns. So as Michael said, it was delayed. Even like I had a show in Vienna recently, which was also delayed by like 2 weeks because of like shipping issues, like shipping from Africa anywhere in the world. It's difficult, not even to talk about shipping things within the continent or moving things in the continent. But at least the good thing about Kenya is that it's always been quite open. And between Kenya and Ghana, you don't need a visa to move in between. And also now I think Kenya has opened up to like most of the continent. So certainly in terms of like the body mobility, it might be a bit easy, but in terms of like moving like objects and other things, it's still very much a challenge that we have to address in the future.
And the irony again, just props to the team for on both sides for dealing with this. But and just an example of with the shipping, the work is coming in and going out. And apologies if this is too logistical for this conversation, but I think it's a good articulation of some of the challenges.
Yes.
The work is coming in and out. There is no commercial value. Our laws say that's absolutely fine. You put a bond, the work comes in and out. But then that means obviously custom guys aren't making their money. So what do? They go and hold the work in storage and then charge you for storage. These are things that you can't foresee, but it's a very irritating part. And if there's anyone from customs on this call, please adjust. but then customs, their incentive is to delay and delay and delay because then they can charge you more and more for the process. And so the irony is that the laws and so on that are there are great. Like it allows us to do these things and would allow us to do these things in a way that is much more cost effective. But the challenges on the ground are you're at the hands of people that don't fully they're not in it to help you do it basically. I also look forward to us coming your way.
Yes.
And learning a bit there, and there are things like, for me, I find how you've done your education program. I have no idea. You must have thousands of children that come through SCCA in a year.
Tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands,
Yes.
And that for me is just like, it is so beautiful to hear that. And that's something where I hope we can learn, and learn how was it working with I assume they're from government schools, and how was it working with government schools to get them to agree to come?
The thing is that we have this, of course, there's a central government, and then they have like the Ministry of Education, and then they have like all these other institutions across the country in different regions. Like they have like the regional coordinating councils of like the education ministry and all the other sectors. So in the beginning, when we started running workshops and other things, we realized that it was very easy for the private schools to make those trips. So sometimes I always used to joke that when the kids arrive from the private schools from the buses and they open the bus and you dare touch any of the kids, their hand is so chilled from the air conditioning. You think that they were like just being removed from like a cold store or something.
That's so heavy, man.
Meanwhile, the kids in the rural areas who are like in the public schools and all that, they don't have any means to come. And then when sometimes their teachers are like pushing to bring them, their teachers would for instance, rent a Moto King, like those tricycles they use in the market. And then I remember one time I was at the studio and I saw like a group of public school kids very early on. They were like 50 something. And I asked, I didn't, there was nothing there. I saw one Moto King. So I saw them and I asked their teacher, how did you come here? They said, oh, we're all in that Moto King. And I said, come on, you're not serious. And then so when we went through the workshop and everything, at the end of the day, I literally stood by. I wanted to know how all those 50 kids fit in it. That was when it dawned on me about this question of like how like to move people. So when we some of the teachers are very like they are self-motivated. They want to be able to bring their kids to the space. So those are allies that we already have. And sometimes also we have to write letters to those offices, like the education offices, and they have to then now also write letters to the schools, granting them access to be able to visit us. But for the private schools, they can just make the trip on their own. So we have to balance in between that. Or sometimes some of the public schools, the head teachers are already, they have the spirit. So when you talk to them about what you're doing, they're like, oh yes, we're going to make sure our kids come. Or they say one thing, or if we don't have a bus, if you can provide us a bus, we will make sure that every single kid comes. So there are times where we work with a bus company and then there is this university. It's a technical university. It's called the Tamale Technical University. They have several buses. So we write to the transport officer. It's like the public university. We write to the transport officer and we're like, can you loan us your bus for X number of days when you're not using it? So we can buy fuel into the bus. Because if we're going to rent the buses in town, then we have to pay more and then we'll have less money to be able to buy snacks or drinks for the students to motivate them even more to make the visit. But if we're using this public transport, then we save a lot of money. Then the money we save can go into cooking for the kids and like all other activities, snacks and all other things. So we can keep them, let's say, for the whole day instead of just bringing them for an hour or something. So those are some of the strategies that we had to use, both having to provide like food because the whole thing is about food security. It's both food for the mind, but also literally food. You cannot bring kids to see contemporary art on an empty stomach. And a lot of these kids are coming from very difficult backgrounds. And it's also not good enough to think that, oh, we have enough kids coming, and you realize that the demographics of these kids are just kids who are coming from well-to-do backgrounds. I think the real work is for our institutions to challenge itself and to think that the question of redistribution is where the work is because it's already difficult enough to be able to do what we do, but then to be able to go the extra mile, to be able to like redistribute by getting buses, writing letters, going to meet like people in the states to be able to like, for instance, adjust certain policies that allow for these kinds of visits and like workshops and education extension programs. I think that is where the work sometimes also lies in.
Have you been able to do that with the government?
No,
Get policy
not yet.
changes and stuff?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. It's still very difficult because art is not really like at the end of the day, it's not like we don't make art because of commercial gains, but of course it can also generate that. So sometimes it's difficult for people to understand because they want to translate everything into numbers. And whilst we are translating things into like spirit and like motivation and imagination and all that, and it's still very difficult. But I have a lot of like really important people from different sectors who constantly like engaging us or coming through the institution and asking questions. And then we're hoping that one way or the other, at some point, we will be able to make that kind of influence on a policy level. But currently, we're just somehow focusing on the local population.
I wonder how that's played out for you in Nairobi, Michael, with NCAI, because Nairobi is certainly not the kind of city where you can walk in off the street into any kind of institution, right? Like there are certain barriers to access and also like certain perceptions of what spaces are open and what are closed. And yeah, so the amount of checks, the number of checks that you have to go through to enter a communal space or a supported public space or to invite audiences into a space of hosting are significantly different in this context. And I experience that especially when I go to Dakar, and the fact that you can walk into raw material company and be in the back of the house without anybody asking you where in particular you're going. Nairobi doesn't perform itself like that. So I wonder, yeah, and I know that NCAI, of course, has various collaborations around the city, including with some communities similar to what Ibrahim was describing, Mazari Social Justice Center, like informal settlements and communities where um, the to communities to whom the city isn't necessarily always as open as it is to us. So I wonder how those questions come up when you think about hosting in a place like Nairobi, and in an institution like NCAI especially.
It's been super interesting, and even just taking this education thing as a as an illustration of the wider challenges. For a long time, I was putting a lot of pressure, saying, "Why aren't we getting these government schools?" Blah 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 blah. But then, of course, the teachers are like, "Well, we don't even basically have it on our syllabus." Like, so we have no, like, literally, we have no incentive at all to come. There's nothing that it doesn't benefit us for the wider system. It doesn't benefit anything, and it has meant actually going. And I wish a couple of the team could get up and talk about this, but it's meant actually going into schools and doing projects, whether that's and fundamentally also working with other people, where for me and Kai's success will always be dependent upon our ability to work with others. Like, whatever we do, it will be partnerships that make us successful and us to legitimately have a place within the community. And education has been a perfect illustration of that. And then doing from mural projects, working with artists who are within those communities and then going out has then given the opportunity after, in some cases, it's taken months, if not years, to then say, now, if we invite you and we, exactly like Ibrahim is saying, provide the transport, the food, all of these things, then kids can come and they'll come visit, as well as doing stuff in the schools and in the communities. And I think that's something, for me, I just didn't anticipate that. I didn't anticipate the resistance from schools to visit. And I also didn't anticipate how much of the schools education part of what we're doing would have to be out in the community and not on site. And I think that speaks a lot to what you're getting at, Renee, where not only is the neighborhood an issue, but then there's the perception, there's literally the transport to get there. Although we do have, we are on basically a Matatu stop, but there are lots of other things apart from that to consider. And I think it's one of the, on the other side, the good thing with being in a mall is that you have security. There are things you also have to consider if you have a collection, like insurance, which you can't do in certain places. So it's a funny mess that makes a place functional or dysfunctional, especially working in a city, where there are ways of operating that aren't familiar. So if you take, for example, art insurance, an art insurer thinks that if you're in Nairobi, we're protesting, although we are doing that at the moment, all the time, and everything's going to burn down and you'll never be able to get insurance for anything. So you have to have certain ridiculous stipulations that wouldn't apply in most places, just in order to be able to have that, and there are things like that where you've got a perception of a place and then the reality, and some, you just have to fight to make it work. But certainly providing access is one of our biggest challenges. We don't charge for any of our things. That's really, for me, that's fundamental. Like, I do not believe in any situation that people should pay to experience art. And I've been a huge beneficiary of that in museums around the world, and I don't, I understand how it can subsidize fees and subsidize the running of institutions and all these things, but fundamentally, I just don't believe that art is made with that in mind and should exist in that space. Maybe I'm going to have to eat humble pie one day in the future, but that for me is also something that is important.
Yeah.
But then you also have to, as I said before, you have to make it something that people want to come and see and be part of and do. And then people will find a way.
Yeah, you speaking about insurance, Michael, has reminded me that this week my bank took out a life insurance policy on me, completely unprompted. Just, uh,
You need to watch your
I don't know
back.
if I don't know if they know something that I don't know. But I think like in following to this idea of like imagining and building new cultural architecture, I want to ask you both what you are learning. And I think specifically, I'll ask you first, Michael, because I think you really have prioritized thinking about previous generations of artists and how to like return them to like the kind of circulation that acknowledges their role. And that in itself is a hosting practice, right? Working against temporalities, thinking back and projecting forward. So yeah, the question is essentially like, what are you learning about the past and what are the projections that you perceive towards the future? And how might this also be a part of the work of reimagining what institutions in Africa can be, including thinking about like what frameworks you are proposing versus what frameworks you are rejecting?
Wow. Okay. The first part of the question was about
But
learnings from
yes,
past. Yeah,
yes,
cool.
and projections into the future. So, like,
Yeah.
what have you seen, and what do you anticipate?
Um, One thing that is clear is that when I speak to the older generations, they really were a community. I mean, people also had their issues, but I feel that that at different stages we had spaces and organizations that were able to host conversations, to host people making things, whether it's payapa, whether it's just people going around to people's houses, whatever, or even the commercial galleries, whatever that is. There were seemingly very healthy spaces in which artists could be. I think one of the things that is also for me that's been interesting is just, and this has really come through doing the collection side of things, is learning what's been made. I mean, so much of it I've never seen myself. Like I'm learning about all the artists in a much more in-depth way. And if I take my own practice, and I feel like this is also indicative of other artists who also don't have access to their own histories. If I take my own practice, I was super excited as this novel idea of using bark cloth, and lo and behold, it is so used and so whatever. But I just had no way of finding out about that. Like there was nowhere for me to research in a way that didn't involve me, deciding to go to Kampala and researching for myself all the various artists from then and so on. The other thing is that there have been key figures, there have been key forms of expression that have changed things, and it's in a way that the narrative has not been told. Even now, still hasn't been articulated. The normal way of talking about art removes agency within the region, has removed agency from the artists and made it like these kind of compulsive behavior to produce these things. Whereas there's been a much more considered positioning by the artists throughout throughout the last, whatever it is now, nearly probably 80 years, 70, 80 years. So there historically there are those things. It's been interesting, Kenya is our little art scene, small as it is wonderfully complicated. And trying to collect has been incredibly difficult, if I'm totally honest. Trying to collect older things has been insane. Like, we've ended up buying stuff from Japan, from Switzerland, from Germany, from London, and not a huge amount from home. And I don't know if that's also just people warming up to the idea, and visibility, or it's just that a lot of the work did end up abroad. And a lot of the work did definitely end up abroad. I mean, you have places like the World Culture Museum in Frankfurt with something like 130 works of Jack Katarikawe, and they're there for anthropological purposes, not as contemporary art. So, and they've actually been a great people to work with. We just couldn't get over some of our laws that allowed us to keep stuff. But anyway, thinking of the future, something that's been interesting to me, both starting with NCAI and thinking about it from 2017 onwards, is there were so many. When I say so many, there were maybe 5 or 6 museum projects that were in play in Nairobi, that you'd talk to different people and these things would be happening. One of the things I feel that we've done correctly is start with the content and not with the building. Start with like the things that need to happen. What we needed wasn't necessarily a building. I think now that we have a functioning program, we need a building. We need the security of a building. But I think previously at that time, what people would see is these massive projects, usually in the West, where people raise X many $100 million to build their sparkling new building, and people think that that's what the museum is, but it really isn't. Like, that is just the structure that people come and visit. The people inside, the programming, the collection, all of those things are are actually what is important. And the thing for me that's been really exciting about these last 5 to 10 years is just how many artist-led projects there are now in the region. And people are doing what they can. I think there was a distinct shift in 2017 when the charity model has waned quite a bit. The Corona Trust vibe dying a death, and some of the other things that went on. And it's, for me, incredibly encouraging. And those are also all our partnerships are with artist-led organizations. And I think that is the way the future is going. I think there has been a change in resources where artists like Ibrahim and myself, we've been able to make enough money to start these things. It's very difficult to make enough to sustain and grow something forever. So you've got to think of other models and other ways forward to make it last. But I just think what I'm really excited by is that lots of people doing different things. I don't see repetition in the exciting projects.
Ibrahim, do you think? Sorry, am I on? Sorry, yes. Yeah. I wonder if you have any similar reflections about like what heritages that you have been drawing on in establishing and running SCCA, what learnings that you can bring from the past, and then also just like what general projections you're making into what could be future of contemporary art in northern Ghana.
Well, for me, it's not just North. Like, of course, for me to be in the North, it was a very political decision. This idea of like going to this place, which historically, like, it was only thought of as a pot for extracting labor and all that. and also within the colonial period, during the period of the transatlantic slave trade. A lot of people who were captured and sold into slavery were coming from the Northern Territory and all that. You can think about Burkina Faso, like the upper part of Ghana and all that, Niger, things like that. So for me, it was always very important with regards to thinking about how we could invest into these places from a cultural and artistic point of view. But also the question of restitution is very important in the sense that a lot of like objects or like the phenomenons that happen in the South with regards to the history of the railway and many other things were as a result of the labor, the extracted labor, the indentured servants from most of these places from the North and others. And so one of the questions of like being a host also through the practice has been about how to, for instance, look into like the history of objects which are connected to these forms, historical forms that we're dealing with, which are almost like disappearing and being marginalized. So like collecting these objects and then going through this huge effort of like dismantling them, taking them, working with like engineers and other people, taking them all the way to the north and then resituating them there and then bringing new life forms back into them and then using that as a means of expanding the question of what it means to be able to build an institution within the time that we're living in, because it is very important for these objects also to be able to perform a role and a function. If an object has a scar in it, certainly you realize that there is a story for it to tell. So it's not this idea of like erasure, but this idea of like excavating and also creating a premise for other things to happen. So certainly for me, it's that model has been important of this idea of like looking into the past. But it's not just the idea of just looking into the past for the sake of it, but it's somehow the idea of, it's not just for the sake of nostalgia or things like that, but the idea of like, because even in our post-independence era, there were a lot of interesting things that was happening within that time, like Ghana, part of the non-alliance movement, like the relationship between like Ghana and the Eastern Bloc, like the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, the architecture that was being built, a lot of the things that were abandoned, factories that were being built at the time, things like that. And then we are asking ourselves as a generation, like we're always talking about what the future will look like. Of course, I'm interested in what the future will look like, but sometimes you also just realize that the future that you're aiming for sometimes already happened or it almost happened but didn't happen maybe 60 years ago. And now we have to almost become these archaeologists and dig back into the past 60 years and then excavate these futures that are trapped in the past. And then when you take them out, you go and encounter these futures which are stuck in the past. You realize that the way you deal with them in the future that is yet to come will be different, because now you can learn from the histories of failures that are embodied within these failures, within these futures that are trapped in the past. And one example is the way it allows us to reimagine our relationship to the ecosystem. So in one of the spaces we have in Nkrumah Volini, we have an army of bats and a whole ecosystem of bats living in the building. And this building was built by the Russians back in the 60s. And I remember when I bought the building in COVID times from the States, it was going to be torn down, and I made a proposal, negotiated, and bought the building because I said this is a very important building because of what it marks in the post-independence era, blah, blah, blah. So they sold the building to me. And then once I went into the building to excavate and clean up and everything, I realized that there was like a whole ecosystem in it. So it really allowed me to go back to learn more about the history of the building again and all that. And I realized that keeping the ecosystem in it suddenly changed our relationship to the building and our relationship to ecosystem, because museums abroad, when you go there, mostly they're white cube spaces. And then it's about when you go into the museum, you almost have to let your baggage off and then deal with what is inside the museum. But the idea that in these artist-led projects that we're doing on the continent with all the conditions that we have here, and also our relationship to like the ecosystems, like ecological forms and all that, it is important because in Red Clay, sometimes you go into the gallery, into the studio space where we have like permanent installations or archives, and then you find that there are goats walking around or things like that. But you'll never find this in a museum in America or something. So, oh, let's it's about animal rights, like someone is a vegan, but they will not imagine the goats in a gallery. I'm like, that is not, yeah. If you say we have to share this world, then we truly have to share the world. Sharing the world doesn't mean that it's only for human beings. And we, us in a position saying that, oh yeah, we believe in this, but truly we're not going to put ready to put ourselves in the same context as these ecosystems. So the question again is truly, if we want to build a world, how are we going to build a world that actually embraces the world in what it is? Because humanity is one of the youngest species on the planet, but we have been so destructive, and so we've almost brought the planet to a brink of collapse in the last 200 to 300 years alone. And it's getting worse as the years go by. So those are some of the questions. And pedagogy, education constantly comes back again and again through the work that we do. So for me, one of the most interesting things is how we are trying to like really reinforce this idea of education, but also again with NCAI and what Michael is doing with the work of the older artists, and also through our own work, because we have to come to realize that there hasn't been such a time in the history of the world as we're living in now. Because as Michael said, it's almost impossible to get access to these older works. But it's only in our timeline, in this moment, that artists have to realize that you have the opportunity to be able to create these new forms of justices which maybe did not exist. Because your work now can become part of a much larger conversation within an ecosystem. Whereas maybe the artists from the other generation, most of their works are almost either lost in time, or it is actually in other parts of the world in collections or in storage spaces, which almost, if we're care is not taken, an entire generation or many generations, it will go into a state of oblivion. So the question of justice is an important one. So I think the more and more we work, the more we come back to these questions through either the physicality of the works or the ecosystems that we're living within, and trying to see how we can truly bring these things together.
I think there's also something in that. Just this is really short. Just for young artists today, is the importance of having your work in collections where other people
Yes.
can see it and it can have a context.
Mhm.
I don't think that's something that's said enough or
Mhm.
visible enough in the region, because there aren't those visible collections.
Mhm.
And it's something, to be honest, at first it's actually been quite difficult, is articulating that without without sounding too arrogant, saying, like, of course you
Mhm.
want to be with us,
Yes.
but the point is, like, if it isn't in those collections, no one has the incentive to, one, present your work, give it a context, and for it to last. And I know institutions have also come under a massive amount of criticism, um, worldwide. But I do think they are an incredibly important part of the whole ecosystem. And I think, again, particularly the non-profit side of art spaces is an incredibly, like, fundamental part of that. And I can only encourage everybody to participate as much as possible in whatever way people can, because it needs that.
Yes.
Well, thank you both. And I think while we're on the question of pedagogy, we can open the floor up to questions. Luca, I think you had tapped a question, but you're ready to ask it now?
Yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you guys for your talk. I put the question in the chat as well. I'm just going to sort of read it to you guys as well, but it's back there for you to refer to. I just want to contextualize a little bit. I'm a current college student, and I come from a line of teachers. And my grandfather had an English school in central Brazil, sort of similar to Tamale. And my mother immigrated to the US and began a Brazilian Portuguese language school. So I've always been interested in institution building as a form of art in connection to labor and also duration. So my question is, in relation to your institutions and also personally, what are your interpretations of the term durational pedagogies? And then also, how do you approach or view the idea of labor in relation to institution building as artistic practice?
Hey, lekker, yeah.
Go for it, Ibrahim.
Okay, no, I think no, right. Rather, thank you very much, Luca. That's a good question, honestly. I think the question of labor, of course, is very important. I give you a quick anecdote. So there is our caretaker at Red Clay is called Zachariah. We call him Assemblyman. When I first decided to build this thing here, he used to be the assemblyman of the village in the area. And this whole area was like farming community. So like aside the people living in the village, there was nothing, there was no settlement here, aside like the original settlement of like the two villages, which is Jana and Janacham. So they were selling land, which I came to buy, proposing to build a studio. And they said, yes, we'll help you to build it. And then I started working with like the members of the community, both the men and the women. But Assemblyman was like the one who's like taking care of like making sure everything is like intact at night. No one comes to steal cement or anything, because like we're storing things in open space in a small storage space whilst you're building. And over the years, he has kids, his kids are playing at the site, we're having conversations, artists are coming, my colleagues, friends are coming over, blah, blah, blah. And then the Red Clay eventually opens. I have all my colleagues like from the Black Star Alliance, intellectuals, artists, everyone coming there. Everyone is having conversations with him. We have a first arts exhibition. Of course, like he takes people around the collections, things like that, even like all the school kids who are coming. And one of the periods we had, what's the name? We were doing a collaboration with the Aarhus Museum in Denmark, and we had a loan from the artist Olaf Eliassen, like through the museum had a work, a piece, so they loaned this to us to show. And the assemblyman, Zachariah, would take the kids through the collection, showing them like the exhibition and also the collection, like some of the works that I have, which are in like public collections around the world, but which is also part of the permanent collection of like the studio, which people can just come and see. And it's really interesting in terms of how language is able, like he's able to use the local language in order to be able to articulate these intellectual forms within it. But it's also interesting that he's the same person who is also contributing his physical like labor in like taking a shovel, digging the ground for the physical foundation of the institution to be built. So the question is that because most often when we go to institutions in the West, even I always argue that when you go to like some of the big museums, most of the security and then the cleaning staff are minorities, and most of the audiences are middle class white people. And you always ask, why is it that you don't see enough people of color or other people in here? Or just a few blocks from here, there's like let's say the Portuguese or Brazilian community or Black community. Why don't they come to the institution? But because so we've always separated the labor. We've always separated the question of the labor from like the way that art is disseminated and all that, and for us, it's very important for us to be able to do this and to be able to see this. And I think so that's where for me, I don't think that we have to separate the question of labor from how institutions like are run or how institutions are redistributed. I think the labor is where actually the artistic sensibilities can actually be thought about. And your question of the durational pedagogy is actually also embedded within that, because it's all part of the same language and part of the same conversation in terms of how we're able to like redistribute these sensibilities across different personalities who are contributing to like these new forms that we're trying to imagine.
What is a durational pedagogy? Pedagogy.
Pedagogy. Yeah, but I think it's a way of like thinking about like in terms of like the idea of like education, but thinking about it in relation to the idea of time in itself. Yeah. So for me, at least, that's how I understand it. Yeah. Whether like how it functions in different timelines or different time scales and all that. Yeah. Sometimes it might work in one particular time scale, and another timeline, it might not work within that. Yeah. Within that context. So
Yeah, beautiful.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but I think,
that's
Michael,
beautiful.
maybe you have, because for me, I think the question, East Africa is quite a very unique and interesting place. And for me, I'm very, very, very much interested in when I can have enough time to just come there for like a while, like just come there for like 6 months, just to be able to understand and like live within that context, like just try to understand what it is, because I've only been in Kenya once, and it was like traveling transit from Lubumbashi, and
Mm.
the middle of the night, and there was so much traffic, and I was like, "What is 1 a.m. and there's traffic? How am I going to deal with this place in like 10 a.m. in the morning?"
You need to come, and I need to
Like,
come visit you, but you need to come for longer. Definitely. This
yeah.
we'll figure out at some point.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But I think, yeah, maybe it might be, maybe you have a different response in relation to like maybe the question of labor in relation to
No,
because
I very much agree with everything you've said, and I think there's often an assumption because somebody doesn't have a particular education that they are lesser served to articulate something, and that is just not the case. There and I think and when I say education, I mean like exposure to a particular type of language is basically what I'm talking about, and then how one talks about art and so on, and exactly how you were saying how the Assemblyman, great title,
yes.
uh, also is able to articulate things in a way that someone else may not, is super important. And I think that also speaks to the challenge of people coming to a space. And as you asked, Renee, in the beginning about feeling at home and welcome and hosted and so on, is language. And being aware of people's different experiences. I think there is a challenge for me that I still wrestle with, and that's around, for example, fees and stuff like this, where I don't fully know, and I think it's a work in progress. Obviously, I think everyone should be paid for whatever one does with an institution and so on. But when you're trying to work in a way that's international, I think there is sort of a pressure that comes on fees, which is to pay what MoMA pay or something like this, where quite frankly that is just unsustainable for a particular environment, for and the world in which people also expect a two-tier fee system. These are things which I think are really problematic, but come from come from the position in which our economies and countries are in, and the value of the financial value of labor within that. And I don't say this with any particular idea, but it bothers me a lot. I find it very difficult that someone's monthly salary is the same as a fee to talk once for one evening, and that person has to sit, whose monthly salary has to sit and sit with that. And I don't, as I'm saying, I don't have or know a solution, but I think there are a lot of I feel like the thinking, and there has to be a better way of things operating than they are at the moment. From a, yeah. I know. Sorry, I keep coming back to very practical,
No, it's
logistical
very the
issues, but
practical.
they're things that are always
So
on
the
the mind.
practical things are very important. They're very important because again, the question of labor, like sometimes I think if we, for instance, like okay, let me start from my practice from if I am interested, for instance, in the remnant of an old factory, or if I like collecting like materials from the market space in order to be able to make a collage or drawing or whatever, or either photographs or whatever. And then I realized that that in itself already as an embodiment of a certain, let's say, historical labor forms, like the market women working in the market, like everyday work to work. They don't earn much from their work, all these things. You collect these materials like residues, and then you use it to produce the work as an artist. And then because in art, when an artist produces something, the value of the work already, like the objects already transforms. Because if I, for instance, save like the work I recently did in Vienna, this idea that the train was like going to be scrapped by the government and I collected it. When you make art with it, it's no longer the same train. It changes set. The value of this train now is even more valuable than when the train was first originally produced. It's a paradox. It doesn't really make any sense. But then again, when you produce that work and you bring it in the context of, let's say, these institutional forms that we're creating, we have to imagine that the collective labor of the world and the society is embedded within, comes into the studio. And that is where I think the politics becomes interesting in such a way that it opens itself up to already everyone. So again, it has to be accessible, it has to be free, it has to be this and that, and it also becomes something that all of us share within. So as much as the artist's intellectual work and property, but it also realizes that it becomes part of a much more bigger global inheritance than the kid from the village, the women from the market, and all that. So everyone becomes it's actually the labor of these people are brought and implicated directly within this studio or system or institution or whatever, which we have to somehow distinguish between how that works versus how the global institutional system works. And in so doing, we would, for instance, work more towards expanding those new forms of producing and thinking.
I think that there are some questions in the chat, and actually one question in particular that I think is related to what you were just saying, Ibrahim, about like thinking about how to create a space that isn't necessarily parochial, but then isn't as well like extractive and performatively global. A War on Yango has a question here. They say, Michael, I find it super interesting that you're finding these East African works in Frankfurt and Japan. How is NCAI working towards remedying the future of artists' works in private inaccessible collections outside of Kenya? Is this something that your adventures into collections has inspired? Ibrahim, you had spoken about worrying for your work in 50 years as well. Are there measures that you consider, or is this an impossible question? The question is from Awar, sorry. I can actually tag on another question to that because I think it's kind of similar. Tony Wainaina asks, as the default custodians of national repositories of material culture, of which art is central, what are, I don't know if you're the default custodians, but congratulations. What are your thoughts and experiences around the involvement of African governments in art institution building?
It could be better. That's the extent of my thoughts on that. And just on the initial question of collections, so NCAI's collection is around 130 works. A large amount of that, I think 62 or 63 works came from the East African. We took on the entire East African collection from the Loder collection. Robert Loder was a figure that set up many of the workshops and things in the 80s and 90s, went on to start Gasworks with Alessio Antonelli and the Triangle Network, like all these things. Major figure. He passed away, I think, in 2017. And through conversations with his kids, we came to, for me, a very positive agreement for both to part buy, part gift those 60-something works. So that's one example. Others are literally just having to buy and ship the work. We've done that with an amazing piece that we have by Peterson Kamwadi that had never been shown in Kenya and is now part of our collection. The difficulty with all of this is, again, it costs so much to do. Like, like once something leaves, they usually add on their premium. So you got to do that, and then you got to pay to ship it back. And not to bring everything back to the finances, but that is a significant limiting factor in these things. And when you do find, which we have found in both Japan and the UK, extraordinary people who are also very generous, that makes these things possible. But you do really need a lot of goodwill on the part of the people who either collected or who are the descendants of the collectors previously. In terms of keeping stuff in Nairobi so it doesn't happen again, I don't have a problem with stuff going internationally, but I do have a problem with nothing being left at home. So and like that, I am grateful to the way that we've worked so far with commercial galleries in Kenya. I always hope that things could be more generous and more whatever, but anyway, but they've been fantastic. And it's just, and I say this from the experience of working with international galleries, where as a strategy, institutional placements are prioritized. And that can create difficulties for the commercial galleries and whatever, but that does allow Western institutions to keep maintaining extraordinary collections. So the part of commercial galleries is also extremely important in that, and who they choose to one, approach with the work that they have to place, but also who they choose to place it with. So, yeah.
Thank you. Ibrahim, as you think about that, maybe I can address a question to you. That is the question from Peterson Waweru. And they say the COVID pandemic emerges on the heels of the start of both SCCA and NCAI. And the question specifically is, did this create any shifts to the foundational intentions and or ambitions of either institution?
Yeah, I think it did, certainly, because COVID was quite an interesting time. In the question of Tamale, we did not have any major lockdown. We only had 1 day of lockdown. And it was a day where they asked people to stay home because they were going to disinfect the city. So they're going to like spray. And I swear to you, I genuinely believe it was just water they sprayed around the city just to give us a sense that they did something. I was like, come on. Yeah, I really didn't believe that they disinfected the city. So that was it. And then the rest of the time, we were just, again, like there were some restrictions you could not, because here the major mode of transportation is through the motorbikes. So not two people were not allowed to sit on a motorbike, but it did not make any sense because then even if two people from the same household cannot sit on a bike, they live in the same household, So there were a lot of things that somehow was kind of interesting. But then again, it gave us the chance because again, I wasn't traveling quite a lot. And because we had to focus on just being here, the idea was to, of course, we couldn't also do workshops within that period because of the restrictions with schools and all that. And of course, the numbers here were quite very low in terms of the north of Ghana, but it gave us the chance to be able to reflect. And also because our institutions in terms of scale are just open, people could just visit. I think there was a period in SCCA, which for how long? For like 3 months, we were not really open to the public. But Red Clay, because it's much bigger in terms of the land, there were a lot of people who could come there. And I spent most of that time actually doing the work at the silo because I was buying the silo from the government. And then we were spending most of the time excavating the space, trying to understand what it was in the history of Ghana, blah, blah, blah. And when we encountered this ecosystem and everything in the space, we realized that philosophically, it could be really a really good, interesting starting point in terms of really thinking about why we're building the institution the way we're building it and who is the institution for. So are we building the institution for younger people, for older people? What kind of ecosystem are we building it for? So it made us a bit more culturally sensitive with regards to thinking about even just the ecosystem, because here in Tamale, for the longest period, like there's been like a good vegetation, like the savanna vegetation, and you had like an ecosystem of bats, of owls, of special types of birds and all that, because we have one of the largest wildlife reserves in Ghana, in the north here, and people go there to like photograph birds and all that. But I realized that because of urbanization, a lot of these ecosystems were beginning to disappear. And because the kind of architecture we're involved in, building like bigger buildings with like open trusses and things like that, you realize that there were a lot of birds who were like beginning to take safe haven within like the trusses of the building and all that. And I realized that it was becoming something a bit more prominent. So, and the question now was somehow to rethink about the question of access, not just in relation to us as people, but access in relation to the ecosystem. So that again took me back to the question of, for instance, acquiring the trains and then all the airplanes and all the other things, and then also like archives and all kinds of other things like vinyls, high life music, all kinds of other things, which before I wasn't really very much focused on. So the question of being able to like excavate this post-independence ruin actually created this new space for thinking about opening up the institution in many different ways.
Yeah, can I just reiterate, just in case
Yes.
anyone doesn't know Ibrahim's SCCA space, he did just say acquiring the aeroplanes and trains and having buildings with bats in it. I mean, so we're not talking about a 2,000 square foot, little project. Like what is the scale of SCCA? Like what's the scale of it? Like,
well, with the three institutions, currently we have about 200 acres of land. Yeah, so it's very modest. Yeah.
yeah. With three institutions on it.
Yeah,
Again,
yeah. But
just so
also,
also people, yeah.
yeah, but it's also because when I think about it, it's not like I always think of it as if we're building like a small like town and it's like in a way, like thinking about building the art school, like building a brick factory, like we're looking into like I recently there's a really important project that I'm working on in Paris, and in order to do it, we had to like together with the institution, we had to acquire this old glass factory from like the post-independent period. So like acquiring the entire building and then dismantling this entire building, which is like 20,000 square meters, and then transporting it all the way to Tamale to see how we can reconstitute it for building like this work that also becomes like an institution in a much not far distant future. So thinking about buildings, remnants or residues of buildings as archives. So for me, land becomes like almost like the canvas that as artists we work with. So I'm playing with these forms, and scale doesn't scare me. It actually excites me. So because we are doing the things that the state should be doing. The state should be preserving things which they are destroying. And because art doesn't really follow logical path. We as artists, I always say that we're like we are the very premise of our thinking starts with stupidity, because we do the things that normally no one would dare. We're like, no, this thing does not make sense. As artists, we're like exactly what I want to do, because you're looking at the nuances of things, you're reading in between the lines. Even when people are thinking about things that are failing or are collapsing, that is where we're like, no, I'm interested in this. It's almost like scientists or astrophysicists who are interested in looking into like collapsing stars and things like that, and thinking that, oh, through that collapse lies a world into another dimension which we might not know. And I think that is what art does. That courage that it brings, that is what we're constantly looking for, and we're constantly looking to pass it on to other people, either generations to come or the same generations in which we find ourselves in. Yeah, so it's something I don't take for granted.
Have you worked with the government? Just on that last question that someone asked.
No.
No.
It's been difficult, honestly. Aside maybe writing letters through like Salom, artistic director, and our manager, Kodle at the institution, and having these students come in, it's very difficult, honestly. And we hope it will happen, because you meet people in the States. I think sometimes it's a systematic problem, because there are people who work in the States who are interested in collaborations or ways of opening up these conversations and dialogue, but the system itself is not designed to allow for this to happen. So sometimes these individuals are people, like for instance, when I wanted to buy the trains, it was very difficult. It took more than 10 years before I could get access. But it was because someone in the States at the time working in the president's office in the last administration was interested personally in the work that I was doing and was willing to help. So through that particular individual, but on a state level, I tried again and again. And sometimes even they would use like the state, like police to somehow stop you, but then you also like would go and get the same police and then try to reconvince them to like be on your side. And when I say reconvince them, you know what I mean. Yes. So it's a constant negotiation, I swear.
It still makes you sweat, man.
Yes, I swear. I'm already sweating by talking about this.
Well, thank you very much for being very open and very generous with your time. We have a couple of more questions in the Q&A, but I don't think we're going to get to them. I will make a note of them, and hopefully we can put them on the NCAI SCCA social media or somewhere where at some point they can be addressed. We still have 86 participants on the chat, which is only a few less than we started off with. So I'd like to say very, very big thanks to the audience for staying with us. I know we've run a little bit over time. Very grateful to you for sticking to it. Just trying to make sure we don't turn it into a little bit of a hostage situation. Well, I hope that, Ibrahim, that you will have more time to spend in Nairobi in the near future. It's just there. I always say it's just there. Like Nairobi is probably the easiest place to get to from
Yes.
anywhere on the continent, but also from anywhere in the world. You're very welcome. I think in the course of this conversation, you probably have attracted many hosts who would be happy to have you here. We look forward to seeing how the exhibition travels. Congratulations to both of you. Congratulations to the team at NCAI, to the team at NCCA on this wonderful exhibition and this broad initiative towards thinking about like what a Pan-African future, what a shared Pan-African future that acknowledges contemporary art as a part of an ecosystem that nourishes and encourages positive livelihoods can be. So thanks to you both. I don't know how to end this forum, so maybe somebody in the back can help me. But thanks to you both, and please let people know how open you are to engaging with them online or in other spaces, or where they can find you next. If you would both like to mention the exhibitions that you just opened for the people that weren't here at the beginning, I think that would be a nice. So we can continue the cycle of friendship as we travel together.
All yours, Ibrahim.
Oh no, I just opened a show with the Kunsthalle Vienna. It's titled Zlijifa, which basically is us taking this locomotive that was made in Germany and brought to Ghana in like the 80s and 90s and using the mining areas and like reconstituting, like making it into a sculpture together with like 5,000 headpans from like local communities, x-rays, taking it all the way to Vienna for this exhibition. So it's actually quite a very, it's interesting in terms of how it re-examines the human condition, particularly within this difficult time that we find ourselves in. Yeah, so if you have time, you can look up their website or social media to follow up. Kunsthalle Vienna in Austria.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Please send us catalogs and books. We're always, I think NCAI, of course, have a really beautiful reading room, but there's a lot of reading spaces in Nairobi, and we're always grateful to see.
Okay.
Michael?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks so much, Renee, and thanks so much for hosting this as well. And to both teams. Just while it's Austria season for both of us, I'm on the other side of Austria, in Bregenz, in an exhibition titled Michael Armitage, Maria Lasnig, and Chilenge van Rampelberg. And what's really exciting with this is that the exhibition will also tour and come to Nairobi as well. So we opened a couple of days ago with Chilenge in Bregenz at KUB, the Kunsthaus Bregenz. So But thank you all for coming and being part of this. And
thank you both very much. Thanks to the teams. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Good evening, and thank you very much for participating in this talk, and thank you everybody for attending. If you would like to visit the exhibition Notes on Friendship, Breaking Bread, you're welcome to come. We are happy to host you. NCAI is at the Rosalind Riviera Mall in Nairobi, and the show is going to be on until 31st July. Thank you to Ibrahim, Michael, and Renee for your very generous contributions today, your generous sharing, and opening our minds up around what institutions can be. It was very exciting to hear your perspectives, and you've given us a lot of food for thought. Good night.
Yeah.